good evening, morning, afternoon, or whatever time it may be for you. You are about to listen to a Royal Mirror audio story. The audio will be accompanied with visuals to enhance the experience. However, if you prefer to simply listen, they aren't necessary. If you'd like to follow along, or would simply prefer to read the story, you can find a link to the text in the description below. I hope you enjoy. Now, on to our tale. War. Another reality. The Vortex of New Valois. Part 1. The paramedic flinched as the augmented reality lens in his eye flickered, painting indiscernible static over his view of the troubled city of New Valois and the raging, ancient storm overhead. Like most of his fellow citizens, he had the newest model of biologically integrated data chip, or just chip for short, injected into his nervous system at the base of his skull. Like all the latest and greatest tech released by corpos from the Capital Fleet's edge, it was a bug-ridden hunk of scrap. He figured he was getting artifacting in the AR lens's UI because the chip's nav systems were having just as much difficulty adjusting to the new sites of rubble and collapsed structures in his home as he was. Tech hadn't prevented the downfall of New Valois, and now, whether or not it would help the paramedic navigate the ruins was an open question. A gust of wind screeched across the reinforced glass window where the paramedic stood, and each droplet of rain smashed against it with enough force that the man was half worried one might eventually pierce through. He supposed it wasn't any different from most days on Charlemagne. After all, what else could be expected from a planet that was host to a 3-century-old hurricane? The decision to build New Valois on Charlemagne seemed more and more hubristic by the minute. But the faster-than-light portal in this system was critical, and Charlemagne was the only natural satellite in the system with a breathable atmosphere. So, New Valois became a port in a storm. The value of the spaceport had made New Valois rich and populous, but now it was that very advantage that had caused it the most prominent damage. The city's space elevator, with its massive metal tether connecting the ground to space, used for carrying personnel and materials to ships waiting in orbit, had been snapped by the storm and collapsed into the urban sprawl below. The elevator was wider than any of the massive skyscrapers which formed the city's impressive skyline, and the tether was unfathomably long. From his position on the 22nd floor of the governor's office building, the paramedic's eyes could wander along the tether, seeing it curve and wind through the city and out into the distance. Collapsed buildings and other debris caused by its fall surrounded it, the wake of destruction getting wider the further it was from the paramedic. It was as if several millennia of erosion and decay had been wrought on the city in an instant, cutting a canyon from the impact crater at the tip of the tether to its former foundations at the New Valois spaceport. The tether was supposed to be strong enough to survive the natural forces of Charlemagne, and it had weathered the storm before, albeit barely. Perhaps it had been a lack of maintenance that did the tether in. Perhaps it had never been quite up to the task to begin with. As the paramedic stared at the serpentine mass of the tether, curling across the planet's surface, another thought crossed his mind. He remembered the myths of his childhood, myths of the world snake, how it wrapped around reality, and how, when it let go of its own tail, just as the tether had let go of its moorings, it would signal the end of all things. The paramedic's chip dinged a notification inside of his head, pushing his old superstitions out of the way and bringing him back into the present. It seemed technology was going to pull through, at least this once. A green dot indicating his destination further into the city slowly faded into his vision, along with a line starting at his feet, showing him exactly what path to take, as his augmented reality lens finally did its work. Turn right. Proceed down pedestrian Skyway 7. Take the third stairway on your left. The computerized voice spoke the instructions directly into the paramedic's mind, and he started moving again. The tether may have caused massive, sprawling destruction throughout the city, but the danger it posed had passed. The threat facing the people of New Valois now was much smaller. A new biological hazard the locals called the Affliction. It reminded the paramedic of a flesh-eating disease, but he'd never seen one that could so easily contaminate an otherwise healthy host. He pressed his hand protectively against the medical bag swung over his shoulder. He'd recovered it from the wreckage of his emergency response vehicle. It contained several doses of general-purpose bioreconstructive nanomachines. The machines could be used to automatically repair damage from the disease, keeping victims alive, but not curing the affliction. It would help the victims back at the hospital, but it wasn't enough. The paramedic and the people who relied on him needed help that could kill the affliction for good, rather than just staving it off. Communion, the Res Publica's premier philanthropic and political organization, had promised him that help. All he had to do was make it to that little green dot on his AR display. The sound of the storm grew more intense as the paramedic approached the skyway. This particular bridge had been struck by a smaller piece of debris from the space elevator. The left side of it was smashed open, exposing the interior to the elements and leaving a precariously small amount of floor to walk on. The paramedic tensed up as soon as he saw it, but not because of the bridge's structural integrity, nor at the prospect of exposing himself to the storm. What triggered his fight or flight response at seeing the daunting skyway was the prospect of how exposed he would be to his fellow citizens of New Valois. The affliction, the planet's quarantine from the rest of the Universalis Res Publica, and the loss of the space elevator had simultaneously increased the people's need for resources and denied them access to those same resources. Many of the citizens had given up on external salvation and resorted to banditry and thievery to get what they needed. All of the medical supplies and equipment the paramedic carried would make him a very appealing target to those that had made that choice, and he knew it. He kept his eyes up and alert as his boot made the first step out onto the ruined skyway. He kept his body pressed to the side, running his palms along the wall, bracing himself with any juts he could get his hands on. Broken glass crinkled underneath his feet, and the metal support struts of the bridge creaked with his weight because of the damage they had sustained in the disaster. Every sound put him more on edge, shifted his attention away from his balance and towards searching the ground below and every window that surrounded him for possible signs of danger. The bridge began to subtly vibrate beneath him. His left hand clamped down in a white-knuckle grip on the windowsill beside him. Numerous scenarios shot through his mind as to what might be causing the vibrations. A worsening of the storm? Or perhaps the skyway finally breaking down? A distant mechanical rumbling soon put all of his worries to rest. He looked up, and the small flashes of light through the storm confirmed it. A large ship, the kind you'd see in the Capital Fleet, was performing an aggressive burn just above the cloud layer. The ship was dropping as close as it could to the planet's surface without getting sucked into the storm. A smile started to tug at the paramedic's face. Communion had sent the help they promised. With the sounds from the vessel above masking his movements, The paramedic finished the scramble across the broken skyway with a leap and started sprinting towards the indicated stairwell. He'd waited months for this moment, and he wasn't keen on waiting a second longer. Unfortunately for the paramedic, he had been right to be concerned about his exposure on the skyway. He'd been spotted. Now, he had someone waiting for him, too. Panting heavily, the paramedic rested his palm against the wall inside of a small alcove at the bottom of the stairs. It was a long trek down. He was not looking forward to the trip back up those stairs, but there was no way he was trusting a lift with the condition the city was in. A glass door labeled "Emergency" was the only thing that separated him from the ruined city, the raging storm, and that ever-present green dot. He pressed his body against the door, and it flew open, the wind immediately whipping against his face, lashing his skin with rain as he made his way into the alley. He could barely see the way ahead, but it was a straight shot through the alley to the courtyard where whatever or whoever Communion sent to help would arrive. The gap between the two massive towers of glass, concrete, and steel became wider as the paramedic got closer to the end of the alley. More of the gray, swirling sky became visible, but to him it may as well have been a pure white light. He was completely fixated on it, until he saw a sudden movement to his right and ahead of him. A mass began to rise out of a black, rusted waste receptacle set against the edge of the right building. His heart leapt in his chest, and he turned to run back towards the glass door he'd left. But he didn't get far before he heard the voice behind him. "Easy, Liam. You know I'm armed, and I'd hate to get your guts all over the nice shipment you've brought me." Even under the scavenger's full-face hazard mask, Liam recognized the voice of Silas. He was notorious for picking the remaining emergency responders in the city dry of supplies whenever they encountered him. The paramedic had been in enough of those encounters to know to comply. "Come over here, Liam. Now." The paramedic stepped forward, as he was told, closing to within a meter of the scavenger. From here it was easy to see that he was indeed armed with his typical run-down EM-1 railgun. Silas reached out and snatched the medical kit off of Liam's shoulder. As he did so, Liam caught a glimpse of the scav's arm down his sleeve. A red and black patch of necrotic skin was showing through. "Silas, your arm. You have the affliction," Liam noted with a worried tone as he stared at the wound. It seemed more pressing to the paramedic than it did to the scavenger. "Yeah, I know. Why do you think I'm stealing your injections?" Silas shrugged as he looked down into the bag, counting the number. "Guess the money for selling them's pretty good, too." The scavenger looked up from the bag to see Liam staring at him forlornly. "Well, I've got what I want. Now get out of here before I make you." Liam certainly couldn't leave, not with his meeting with Communion so close. He had tried appealing to Silas's humanity before. That hadn't worked, but self-interest might be a new avenue with which the paramedic could make headway. We need those injections at the medical center to keep things up and running, to keep working towards a solution for you and all the other citizens of New Valois. Come with me to the medical center. Wait your turn for an injection, and you'll have a steady supply. If you steal them now, you'll never get more, and you'll be hurting yourself in the long run." Silas took one long look at the paramedic, dropped the syringes, then used both of his hands to smash the butt of his rifle into Liam's face, sending the other man down on hands and knees with a split lip. "I'm about to hurt you real bad in the short run if you don't smarten up." The paramedic looked up fearfully at the scavenger as he wiped the blood from his mouth. However, a flickering light overhead of Silas caught the paramedic's eye and filled him with hope. The scavenger realized Liam was looking at something behind him and turned quickly to look at the light. "What is that thing?" he asked, more to himself than to the paramedic. Liam knew what it was, of course, but he wasn't keen on sharing. It was a standard Res Publica drop pod. Help had arrived. The pod swooped down through the storm, following a pre-programmed route to avoid both the now non-existent space elevator as well as the various spires of New Valois. It was clearly using navigation data from before the disaster, dodging ghost buildings as it began to level out and shoot directly towards the courtyard in front of the paramedic, turning its main thruster to provide greater velocity rather than slowing its fall. As his gaze followed the pod, the paramedic realized that it was headed straight for a building that had fallen in against another, leaving a barrier of glass, concrete, and steel in the sky. The paramedic gritted his teeth. But a few desperate moments before the collision, the pod pitched up in an attempt to avoid the obstruction. The bottom of the pod scraped hard against the debris, then pitched downward, directly towards its landing zone. It slammed into the pavement, kicking up dust and chunks of concrete, filling the alleyway that Liam and Silas occupied with an artificial haze. There was a hiss of depressurization as a hatch on top of the pod slipped open. An armored gauntlet reached out to grip the edge, pulling the rest of the occupant's metal-encased body up into view. He was covered head to toe in a series of interlocking metal plates, with a surcoat draped over the armor, flowing down from his shoulders to his calves. A carrier rig and pouches, holding a myriad of supplies and equipment, hung from the warrior's body. Splotches of black, silver, and gunmetal gray crisscrossed against each of the individual plates that sat atop the hexagon-laced undersuit of the pod's occupant. But the flashy armor did nothing to distract from the oversized rifle hanging from his hip. This was the first time the paramedic had seen a member of the Knights Principe in person, but he had certainly heard of them. He had heard enough to know that he considered the tin can-obsessed military order to be an outdated concept, and he had hoped that the Res Publica would revoke their unearned privileges and put an end to their costumed gallivanting sooner rather than later. Still, with the railgun-armed scavenger in front of him, he was glad that Communion had sent at least some sort of martial presence along with their aid package. The impact of the warrior dropping off of the pod and down to the ground pushed those thoughts out of Liam's mind and brought back the sheer fight-or-flight response Silas had put in him. He looked past Silas and into the knight's visorless, full-metal helmet, realizing his own head barely made it up to the center of the knight's chest. He knew that the armor knights wore made them much taller than they actually were. Liam had always thought that was some sort of childish attempt to intimidate their opponents through size, rather than fulfilling an actual military purpose. But he had to admit to himself that, at least in this case, the childish intimidation attempts were working. A slight crackle emerged from the suit, followed by a man's exasperated sigh, interlaced with the mechanical static of the suit's speakers.
Devil neck.
The knight's armored gauntlet reached up to rub his helmet.
The last time I had a headache this bad, well, it was probably the last time I was in New Valois.
A slight laugh came out of the suit's speakers.
I had a lot more fun getting it that time, though.
The paramedic recognized the man's accent. It was similar to the one spoken in the parts of New Valois, still occupied by the original colonists. Silas shakily turned towards the warrior as the knight walked towards the pair, with hands outstretched.
Ah, mes amis. My apologies for the dramatic entrance. Would you do me the pleasure of letting me know which one of you sent the distress call to Communion?
Silas was breathing heavily, but he brought his rifle to his hip and started to charge the rails, mechanical whirring emanating from the rifle. Listen here, metal man. No one on Charlemagne wants communion poking its nose where it doesn't belong. Move along and there won't be any trouble. He was aiming directly at the knight's chest now, but the rifle was still charging. The warrior gestured with an open hand towards the paramedic.
I take it you were the one to send the distress call then?
He laughed again and gave a conciliatory nod towards Silas.
I cannot disagree with you about communion, my friend. However, as you can see, I am a knight, and we wear the finest personal arms and armor in the Res Publica, so we poke where we please.
The knight took a step forward towards Silas, but the scavenger raised his rifle more aggressively. Step back. This thing punched through biologically engineered assault troops in the Shah-Farron War. It'll punch through you, too. The knight cocked his head to the side quizzically, acting more like an eccentric entrepreneur at some corpo mixer than a man on the business end of a railgun.
Hildy, could you check on the status of our shield, s'il te plaît?
There was a happy-sounding ding from the knight's armor, and he nodded.
Wonderful.
He turned his head to face Silas once more.
In that case, my friend, I highly doubt your weapon will prosper against me. My duties as a Knight Principe compel me to advise against combat.
He reached up towards a holster strapped to his chest plate. He slid the pistol he found there not quite all the way out of the holster, displaying it for the scavenger. The paramedic was certain he'd seen it alongside the scavenger's EM1 in old Shah-Farron war media. The knight's firearm even seemed to still have some wooden furniture.
But if you want to try your luck, I'm also a fan of the classics.
A silence descended on the trio. Even the howling wind of the storm seemed to die down, albeit only slightly. The scavenger's shaking hands kept the EM1 level with the knight's chest. Before anyone could commit themselves to a course of action, the old railgun decided for them. Silas had kept it charged for too long, and the energy built up in the rails let out a creaking sigh as it dissipated into the atmosphere around them, making the weapon harmless. The EM1 gave its characteristic ping as the spent battery was ejected. Not one of the rounds in the accompanying ammunition clip had been spent. Silas looked first at Liam, then the knight, and then ran, not even trying to pick up the injections as he disappeared into the mist of the storm, and then into the dilapidated ruins of the old city.
And here, I thought you had to be a gambling man to make it a new Valois.
The knight tutted and shook his head as he watched the scavenger go. The paramedic scrambled to pick up the injections from the ground of the alley as the warrior tucked the handgun away into its holster and held out his now free hand towards Liam.
Hello, my friend. I'm Paladin Gerard Olivier of the Knights Principe, but my friends just call me Voodoo.
Liam looked up at the hand and felt the nerves start to leave his body and his shoulders relax, though he didn't think he could be perfectly comfortable around the personification of violence that was this knight. Still, he was grateful that Silas had been seen off, even if Liam would have preferred a more diplomatic solution. Thanks for the help, Voodoo. The paramedic responded nervously, not sure if he was on friendly enough terms to use the nickname, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. He reached out and took the knight's hand regardless, surprised at how gentle the grip of the metal gauntlet was. Liam quickly broke the handshake and pointed back towards the door to the building. Let's get inside, out of this mess, Liam told the knight, again raising his voice over the wind and the rain. Without waiting for a response from the knight, Liam turned and made his way for the door. The sound of metal against concrete and revving servos from behind indicated the power-armored warrior was indeed following him. He pushed open the door into the building, and the cold, biting wind ceased as he stepped inside. Liam turned to see the towering knight ducking to enter before the glass door sealed shut. The din of the storm disappeared, and Liam continued their conversation at a more reasonable volume. "Do you know when the rest of the assistance from Communion is due to arrive?" The knight tilted his head and let out a small chuckle, raising his free hand to point at his chest.
L'assistance c'est moi, my friend. At least for now.
The knight explained. The paramedic grimaced at the prospect of Communion thinking that one self-righteous gunslinger was going to put an end to the disaster on Charlemagne. He'd expected a medical team or supplies, or at least some sort of way to contact Communion for further assistance or cooperation on ending this threat. Instead, he'd gotten just one man, and a knight at that. The knight placed his gauntlet softly on the paramedic's shoulder.
But I have been quite rude talking about myself this whole time. Please tell me a little bit about you, my friend.
The paramedic took a somewhat uncomfortable glance at the hand on his shoulder, but answered the knight nonetheless. "I'm a search and rescue technician. My name's Liam. I've been coordinating the emergency response personnel here in New Valois since we lost contact with the Res Publica." Voodoo nodded enthusiastically at Liam's mention of his occupation.
Ah, a Sartec, eh? I spent 5 years as a Sartec before my escapades got me put behind a desk.
The knight explained, expressing his appreciation for Liam's expertise.
Speaking of getting me behind a desk, Communion asked me to handle that affliction problem of yours. So I'm going to need to ask for your assistance in accessing the disease control laboratory. Do you think you could help me out?
The paramedic felt relief work its way through his body. At least it seemed like this knight was going to focus on the affliction. The last thing he needed was another man shooting up the streets of New Valois. Perhaps he had been too hasty in his assessment of the knight. Maybe he'd have the skills necessary to assist in the development of some sort of cure. But he was still only one man. "The lab was close to one of the impact sites for the tether, but as far as I know it's still standing, and I do have credentials that should still authorize us to get inside." Voodoo gave a half bow in response.
Thank you, Liam.
He stated simply, before lifting himself back up to his full height. The Sartec glanced towards his bag of injections, then towards the sky outside the glass door. Even with the gray, swirling drab of the hurricane raging overhead, he could tell that the sky was darkening. It would be night soon, and the streets would be even more dangerous. "Would we be able to visit Valette Hospital first? It's on the way, and I need to deliver these injections." The paramedic stole one last nervous glance outside. "I'd also rather not travel to the disease laboratory at night, and Valette is a safe place to sleep." Liam looked at Voodoo expectantly. The knight gave him a nod.
Of course. If my first 5 minutes back in New Valois are any indication of its current state, staying inside while it's dark seems quite prudent.
Voodoo looked at the medical bag.
And it looks like you have some very important cargo indeed.
The knight made another bow and made a flourish with one hand towards the stairs.
Après-vous, my friend.
The knight offered. The paramedic sighed and gave the steps a forlorn look, thinking of the 22 flights he had to ascend. Still, it wasn't quite as daunting as staring down the barrel of an EM-1, at least by a little. Liam and Voodoo had made most of the long trek back to the paramedic's home base at Valette Hospital in relative silence. The paramedic had many questions for his new companion, but it took some time for him to formulate the words and the confidence to ask them. Finally, as they entered the detritus-littered main corridor of another winding office building, one particular event from Silas and Voodoo's standoff stood out in Liam's mind. Who is Hildy, exactly? I heard you talking to someone by that name a bit after you landed. Is she some sort of command and control, or... The paramedic was cut off by a bellowing laugh that was pronounced enough to push some static through Voodoo's suit speakers.
She wishes she was responsible for command and control.
Voodoo replied in a jovial tone. He pointed to the back of his head.
Hildy is an AI integrated with my chip and armor system. Her silicone brain handles all of the critical tasks that my weak flesh brain is liable to forget, shield activation included.
Voodoo kept walking beside the paramedic as he explained Hildy's capabilities.
Knights are encouraged to make custom adjustments to their own AI, so they're a lot more specialized and full of character than your off-the-shelf personal assistant. Hilda here will be invaluable with developing a cure for the infliction, with all the work I've done on her over the years.
Voodoo held up a single finger, gesturing for Liam to stop, which the paramedic did.
Actually, there's something Hildy can do for us right now.
Voodoo tapped the side of his helmet and looked directly at the paramedic.
Hildy, if you can see Liam's chip, activate my livery system in his AR display for me.
There was a short beep of the affirmative from his suit, and Liam watched as new colors faded into his view on the knight's armored frame. Both his surcoat and his armored plates turned a glossy black that somehow managed to stand out against the ever-present gray of New Valois. What stood out even more was the milky white accents and symbols that popped out on the armor, almost seeming to cast light into the environment, even though he knew they only existed on his display. Liam popped up an eyebrow. Sounds like Hildy's pretty impressive, the paramedic said, attempting to venture into a more sarcastic tone. I was really worried that I was going to lose track of a 7-foot-tall super soldier. Voodoo folded his arms, but there was something about his bearing that let the paramedic detect the smile that hid beneath his helmet. Liam tore his eyes away from the warrior to take a furtive glance around the ruined building and look through a cracked window to the dangerous streets below. We should keep moving, he stated simply, and the pair continued their journey. He didn't care to admit it, but the presence of a hulking, heavily armed warrior like Voodoo by his side made Liam feel a lot safer navigating through the broken buildings of New Valois. This feeling of gratitude only became more pronounced as the city grew darker, and the dimmed beams of sunlight that did manage to break through the heavy storm above began to disappear entirely as night fell. Thankfully, the neon red circular medical icon shone off of the hospital in the distance. The circle, with 2 lines extending from the top and bottom edges towards the center, but never meeting, called out to them. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Liam was always cognizant of the fact that it was the icon of the Church of the Anointed. He had often mentioned in casual conversation with his colleagues that something more neutral, with less baggage, should replace it as the symbol of medical services. Now his eyes fixated on that same icon as it shone with a bright white hue off of Voodoo's right shoulder pauldron every time they walked under one of the city's many flickering artificial lights. In the danger and darkness, Liam let go of his self-righteousness and forgot the many differences and ancient wrongdoings that made his stomach churn when he looked at Voodoo. All that remained was a faint hope that underneath the steel and the circuitry, underneath even the knight's very flesh, the same spirit that had built Valette Hospital and so many others like it was still alive. This concludes our Royal Mirror audio story for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If there's an additional part to the story, it should appear in the description below when it is available. I'd like to take this time to thank all of the creators of the open source content used in this video, the ultimate creator, without whom any further creation would be impossible, and of course you, the viewer, for listening to it. Until we meet again, goodbye.